Alright, welcome back everyone. Today we'll be looking at the second explanation for forgetting, which is retrieval failure. First, we're going to be talking about the encoding specificity principle and then move on to explain the two types of forgetting, which are context-dependent forgetting and state-dependent forgetting. Both of them have a study that support these types of forgetting. Then we're going to move on into real-world applications of these findings. They discuss why these studies have a high external validity, ask the question whether cues also help in normal or non-extreme situations. And finally, we're going to look at a study that discusses the difference between recall versus recognition, which is a limitation of these studies. So the encoding specificity principle says the following. In order for a memory to be retrieved successfully with a cue, the cue has to be present at encoding and present at retrieval. If these conditions are not met, then forgetting occurs. Basically, all this means is that a cue has to be present when you're learning something, when you're encoding something, and it has to be present when you retrieve that memory again. If those two things are not met, then you will forget or you will lose access to that piece of information. Okay, so let's use that in the following research. A short overview. There are two types of forgetting: context-dependent forgetting and state-dependent forgetting. Context-dependent forgetting refers to external cues like the weather, the place, a picture on the wall, something that reminds you that was present during encoding when you were learning something, that helps you remember the information that you had remembered in the first place. State-dependent forgetting doesn't mean state as in a nation, state as in your internal state, your feelings, your mental state, something emotional or physiological that can help you remember that memory. Let's look at an example for context-dependent cues. This is a study by Gordon and Badley, 1975, and they had divers learn lists of words either underwater or on land. So when you learn a list on land and then recall that word list underwater, will the performance be worse or better than when you recall the same word list on land instead? So there you can see already there are four possible combinations: learn and recall on land, learn and recall underwater, or learn on land, recall underwater, or learn underwater, recall on land. The results show that there's a 40% higher recall rate when learning and retrieving in the same environment. So doing both underwater or doing both on land is better than mixing it up. And this is proof that context-dependent cues work. It is something about being in the water that helps you remember when you are in the water as well, or the same goes for land. But if you then have to retrieve a word list in another environment, right, then you don't have the environment, you don't have the context to help you remember. Right? So this is a great study to show that context-dependent cues help you remember. This is a study on state-dependent forgetting. Now remember, state refers to your emotional state or your physiological state. So this study was done by Carter and Cassidy in 1998, and the procedure was as follows. The participants were supposed to learn and retrieve information either on drugs or off drugs. And just like in the previous experiment, we now have four possible combinations. And it turns out, so first of all, what does the drug do? It makes you feel drowsy. So it puts you into a different state, right? A different emotional state or a different physiological state. And so when you learn the word list on drugs and then you decode or you retrieve the information on drugs as well, you have a better performance than when you mix it up. Say, learning the word list on drugs and then trying to recall the word lists off drugs. Okay? And the beauty about this is that it's mirrored. So when you study the word list, when you encode it off drugs, and when you decode it and you retrieve it off drugs as well, the recall again is better. Okay? This is an example of a state-dependent cue doing its job in terms of helping you retrieve information. The cool thing about this kind of research is that it's extremely practical. You can apply to your everyday life. Say you wanted to remember what you did at a particular location. Let's say you were at a party and there was a song playing and you remember what that song was. Maybe listening to that song will help you remember the more things about that event. And that would be an example of a state-dependent cue, like she's doing. Or maybe when you're searching for your keys, going back into the room where the keys might be, might help you remember where you put the keys. And that's an example of the context-dependent cue, where the environment, the room, helps you remember where you left that key. Let's look at some research support or limitation of this kind of study. First of all, these studies have a high external validity. Why? Because they were done in real life, right? Think of the divers. So they were not confined to a laboratory where the task might be quite artificial. Well, the task was artificial. You had to remember word lists, but at least they were not stuck in an artificially controlled environment, but they were out in nature. Okay, and so that suggests that we can generalize these findings more to real situations rather than lab experiments. Second of all, there's a counterpoint to be made here to say, you know what? I mean, these context-dependent cues, right? We found them to help us remembering, but only in extreme situations. I mean, seriously, I mean, who goes diving and learning something underwater, right? And so only because these environments were so different were we even able to detect the effect of the cue, of the context-dependent cue. But usually, I mean, our environments don't differ so much at all. Right? For example, if you were to study in 2 different rooms, you're going to have slightly different wall decoration. I don't know if that's going to help you remember anything, but I wouldn't say, for example, if you were to take your final exams in the sports hall, I don't think that learning or taking your psychology classes in the sports hall is significantly going to improve your performance on the final exam, right? Because the environments are not different enough. So maybe the effect of the context-dependent cue is so small that you need very different environments to even be able to measure its effect. A final comment by Godden and Badley, 1980, is this. They redid the original experiment with the divers and asked participants to recognize the words rather than recall them, right? Recall means remember the list, write them all down. I'm not going to tell you what the words were, just write them down. Recognize is more like, was this word on the list? Was this word on the list? And they have to say yes or no, right? And so the results are when participants have to recognize the words rather than recall them, there is no more difference in performance between the 2 different groups. So meaning whether you've studied and recalled the words in the same environment. So the effect of the context-dependent cue is gone. So what is the conclusion here? The conclusion is that maybe retrieval failure is a limited explanation for forgetting because it only applies to recall, not recognition. Right? So the studies cannot be generalized to recognition as well, but we have to confine it to recall. Leave a like if you liked it, subscribe and hit the bell to get notified when we drop a new video. Download these and many more slides for free and consider supporting us on Patreon and get access to detailed mind maps and past exam revision content. If you're a teacher, get free access to ZenTeach, an online quizzing tool with ready-to-go multiple choice quizzes and automated feedback. Make sure to use this invite code, which is, like all links, in the video description below.